I am Joel MacLeod.
And I'm Roland Tanner.
And welcome to the 905er. Last week, across the country, groups of people protesting against trans and LGBTQ student policies in schools gathered in cities across the country. Here in the 905, school boards were targeted. In response, advocates for LGBTQ+ students announced they planned to meet the protesters to counter their message. As Wednesday dawned, it was clear that tension was mounting on social media, with both sides passionate about their arguments. At 10:30 a.m., I decided that I would visit the protests happening in my hometown of Burlington, outside of the Halton District School Board, to see firsthand what was going to be happening. When I arrived, a man was already speaking to the crowd at a microphone, and what I heard was this.
You've noticed in the last 7 years, this country is not as great as it used to be. I could go on about it, but today is about what is destroying it. In my opinion, there's three things. We're talking about what? Identity politics. Making you scared of me, them scared of you. We cannot succumb to identity politics. When we unite, parents right and flight.
I stayed for the next 2 hours to talk to people on both sides, to really hear what each side is concerned with, and to try and strip away some of the rhetoric and the politics, and see what in fact is going on here. What I learned shone a light on how far apart these two sides really are, and how lies, mistruths, and outright deception are driving people to see something that isn't really there. For this episode, we're going to be trying something new. I'm going to sit down with Roland and give you my honest and real take on what I saw happening and what exactly went down at the 1MillionMarch that happened last week across Canada.
You looking to make the most out of this life and optimize your personal wellness? Then check out the Natural Man Podcast. Join me, host Mike C., as we explore all areas of human wellness, physical, mental, and emotional. Learn strategies to optimize your own well-being and be in the driver's seat of your own health. Remember, your doctor works for you. Learn biohacks, neurohacks, ways to improve sleep, and ways to optimize your body and your mind. Check us out on Apple, Spotify, the Fountain app, and at naturalmanpodcast.com.
Hello, and welcome to the 905 podcast. And today we kind of have a special episode, if you like, kind of a 905 roundup, but kind of an interview of Joel, of a recent event which took place across the country, across Ontario, and was certainly present in Halton. And Joel, basically, you went to watch the protests outside school board offices that was happening in Halton earlier in the week. What was it like?
Peaceful. I'll say that much. Because I'm from Burlington, I thought I would look at the Halton School Board's headquarters. Their office is on Guelph Line here in Burlington, and I wanted to take a look. And for the most part, it was a peaceful protest on both sides. There was a large crowd gathered at the northwest corner of the intersection, who were very much, they were the moving core group of protesters. I've heard reports saying that it was in the thousands. I questioned that number. It was definitely in the over 500 in total, but 1,000 I think is a little bit of an exaggeration. But it was a sizable turnout, and then as well, there was the counter protesters who had set up camp as well. There was a gentleman at the microphone who was representing the People's Party of Canada. I saw a lot of People's Party of Canada flags and signage there, and a lot on the back of the PPC banners, there was no perverts in schools were written on the signs. Lots of signs of the nature of, stay away from our kids, education, not indoctrination, that kind of thing. And then, of course, I saw a couple of no vaccination signs, which I think is telling. I mean, this is clearly a holdover from the truck convoy that happened in the waning days of the pandemic. That sentiment has not left this organization. They've just seemed to focus their attention away from pandemic and vaccine policy and mandates to school boards.
I'm pretty sure everybody listening is familiar with what these protests are about, but basically, what the understanding I have anyway is that they are claiming that teachers, schools, the education system generally is trying to force an agenda of trans rights or whatever, or like actually encourage transgender identity in children, and then not to tell parents about it, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is that a fair reflection?
Yeah, I mean, so I got there, and the first group that I went to kind of talk with were the anti-protesters. They were quietly waving trans pride flags and the like. And I went and I spoke with a number of them. They were very cautious when I approached that, and I understand why they weren't sure. I wasn't really identified as any side or whatnot. So there were some I talked to. The ones I did talk to were there because they felt that they needed to be visible. They needed their side to be heard. And again, peaceful and whatnot. I decided to cross the police line, and there were Halton police there, just keeping the two sides separate. But I crossed the line easily enough, and I found. I just want to talk to the other side, see what was going through the protesters' mind, and it was eye opening to say the least. It was kind of interesting to talk with that side. I would say that what you're saying is pretty much right. Whenever I asked, question I constantly asked, like, do you think that the Halton District School Board has a policy of trying to convince children that they are trans? They all said yes. There's this fervent belief that school boards across the province were actively trying to convert students to identify as trans, and then to hide this from their parents. Any time I try to bring up I asked them, like, can you prove it? Can you prove this? Like, where's this documentation? Where have we seen this report, or what stories do we have to back this up? So the answer was always, oh, it's out there. You just have to do your research. And I said, and I found it interesting because I would say, okay, well, their side, the anti-protester side, it's saying they're providing research that kids are just identifying. We have the medical journals. The psychiatrists and psychologists are all saying this is a real thing. Trans teens have suicidal ideation and whatnot, and it's a complex medical approach to making sure that kids are okay, whatever that shape that takes. So when I kind of said, well, okay, where are you seeing that that's not taking place, and that teachers are forcing kids to become trans? There's no documentation. There's no journal that say, okay, look at the journal of this or this science, or this news article in the Toronto Star or Globe and Mail that they can back. It was always, oh, it's out there. You just need to do your research. And I found out, I was always interested when I was, what sources? Because clearly we have two different pools of information that you're drawing your information from. they're saying they have a life experience that they're living. And by that I mean like trans teens and trans people. That's saying they're living an experience. And they're saying this is what they're going through, and so I'm taking that at face value. That I believe that what they're saying is true. You're saying that it's not, it's false, and you have proof to say otherwise. Yet, whenever I say, "Can you provide that? Give me the link. Give me the search that I should be doing." It was always, "Oh, it was on a forum I read. It was on a," and the one thing that always got brought up, and I thought this was noteworthy, is the Matt Walsh, the far right rebel rouser who. His material is always brought up as he's the guy to go to, despite the fact that his no notable doctor or anyone with their namesake in pediatric medicine would back up any of the claims that he says. But that's where they're getting this information from. A lot of it was anecdotal, and the fact that one thing I noticed as I was going on, the fact that I did not buy into their line of reasoning, I kept asking questions, and that exhausted them so much. And it became a point where I got the sense that I was being viewed as not the enemy, but just like I'm definitely not one of them, because I kept asking questions. Well, where are you getting this information from? Who's saying this? Do you have a story? What are we? What do we have to back up these claims? And there's always do your research. It's out there. You just have to look for it. The funny thing is I did afterwards. I said, "Oh, I'm going to do it." So I went back and looked up. I can't find it. Maybe my Google history is so mucked up. I can't find it. I don't know where this stuff is that they're finding. But when I type in, anything trans teens medicine, puberty blockers, whatnot, I'm getting, I find medical journals, studies that say that kind of refute what they're claiming is quote unquote science.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem of the modern age, isn't it? It's of the Trump era, that there's one side of society that's using one type of evidence, and that still basically relies on and trusts evidence coming from one place, basically the same place it's come from our whole lives, which is TV, media, etc. I mean, most of us don't go and read scientific journals for fun. We rely on certain sources to mediate that and put it in a form that we can grasp, and we put a certain amount of trust into that. And we have the other side of society that's decided that anything in those sources is unreliable, that they're not going to trust science either, even if you do go back to the original sources. And yet there's other places that are telling it's the truth in quotation marks. Their side is I would say 90% anecdotal. And by that, I would say, I'll just share this one telling story I thought was interesting. So as I crossed the police line, I found there was a young teen girl who was holding a sign basically saying, "I used to identify as trans, but now I don't. And I was going to be put on puberty blockers." So I reached out to her and I said, "I'm curious to hear your story." And I'm going to paraphrase this, but her story was that she was going through a point in her life where she was beginning to question her sexuality and her identity, and she thought maybe she was a boy, or because she liked to dress up in boys' clothes and whatnot, and she wasn't sure if that meant that she was gay or she was lesbian or whatever have you. And so she went to a therapist, and the therapist said, you might be trans, but you might want to go on puberty blockers. She said that she didn't like it, she didn't want to, and she ultimately decided that she was not trans, she was just a tomboy girl. I take her story at face value because I don't have any reason not to. But what I found telling
was that, okay, so her journey to discover that she's not trans, she's just a tomboy, was something I thought, well, that's what the anti-protesters were asking for themselves, was that ability to freely pursue whether or not they are in fact trans or not. And that might mean some folks might say, I do identify as trans, I want to go on puberty blockers and I want to change my pronoun or whatever have you, and they want the freedom to do that. This person decided not to. And I found it telling that her personal story was, it was viewed as, well, this is what must happen across the board. This is the same story for all people. And it's like but they couldn't take the leap and say, well, maybe there's a, like that. It might not be the case for another teen who's in the same shoes.
I mean, you can read that story two ways. I mean, you can say, oh, this is outrageous. Somebody who wasn't transgender was offering puberty blockers. Or you can say, this is the system working. A youth who was not sure went to an expert, and the expert said, well, here are your options. And they said, no, I don't fancy doing that. Well, success. Everybody wins.
Well, and that's kind of what I took away. Is like, well, isn't that what we want? Is you say, oh, I don't want to do that, and nobody's forcing anyone to take puberty blockers or to undergo gender reassignment surgery or anything of that nature.
And there was no teacher saying, child X, you must take puberty blockers, otherwise you're going to get marked down. And I don't know how they would. Well, and the other, but I found it's the other, the protest side was just full of this contradiction. It was kind of holding two ideas to be true. Every person I talked to would always preface their statements with, I support, I have no problem with gay or lesbian people. And some even went as far as say, I have transgendered friends. Okay. Yes. Sounds true.
But
I've heard that in other contexts over the years.
But in the next breath, I would hear, but there's only two genders.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say, okay, but how do you square this round peg into that round hole? Like that. I wasn't going to refute the logic of that statement because I didn't think, but I could tell, like, at the end, like, I'll give the people protesting, they're concerned about their children, and that there's a fear that things are being kept from them about their children's safety, which on the surface, you're right. Like, I get that as a parent, I get that, but that's where it's this concern is just surface deep. Like, but to say, okay, what's underneath that, and is this actually happening? We're not going to go into that. We're not going to ask those questions to start peeling away the layers of this concern. Because if you do, you might say, yeah, anybody would be concerned about parents being kept something from their about their child's behavior or whatever have you. But to acknowledge that your child might be going through a very formative thing might be just a bit too much for some people to be comfortable with. The other note I should point out is there was a large group of Muslim parents there as well, who had brought their children out as well to the protests, and saw their children marching around it and that kind of thing. There were, and to that, on that regard, for the anti-protest side, there were a number of high schoolers, because this did take place outside of MM Robinson, a high school here in Burlington. There were a number of students. There were a number of students who had come out to, honestly, I would say, support both sides. On that side, I thought that was telling that there is definitely a religious conservative angle to this movement. The person speaking at the microphone I didn't hear them necessarily refer to the Muslim participants in the protests. He did reference God and Christ a lot in his speech, as well as diving into at a number of economic issues, decrying the concentration of wealth in the Toronto stock market and the S&P 500 and whatnot, which I will admit I have no idea what that has to do with trans rights in our schools. But that's the thing, is that there had a number of people say, hey, we've got bigger, on the protest side, they would say, hey, we've got bigger issues with inflation and housing prices and that kind of thing. And I said, yeah, to me that's a bigger issue, honestly. But they didn't seem to see the irony of that. They wouldn't come out to protest, to push for affordable housing or to change planning, zoning bylaws to permit more affordable housing. They decided to come out and protest a perceived threat to children in school boards across Ontario and Canada.
I mean, do you think that, was there a contrast to an extent between what the People's Party of Canada people standing on a podium were saying and what the people in the protest were actually saying?
It mixes. I think that there's an overlap. I got the sense of the people protesting do feel exhausted and helpless in their lives. They do get a sense that they are being screwed over by forces bigger than them, and to an extent, I would argue that that is true. But that this is feasible. This is something that they can actually do, because I think that the idea of, well, how do you fight for affordable housing? How do you fight for better wages? How do you fight for a better quality of life? That's harder to do. There's no, that doesn't really happen. But we can go and say,
there's a long history of moral panic being an excellent way to whip up
that's the thing,
a crowd, right?
And I find it telling that the politicians who showed up to this thing were the People's Party of Canada, because Lord knows they don't have a leg to stand on in any election anywhere in this country. So they don't have an economic platform. They don't have a strong argument to solve the housing crisis that's here in Canada. But we can go pick on transgender people because they're an easy mark. It's the time and time again, right? It's a lot harder to solve economic problems because you do have to piss off the people at the top a lot more than you do the people at the bottom. But if you get the people at the bottom pointing fingers at people who really have no power over them, it's an easy way to pull for their pockets, right? I mean, it's time and time again. It's what right-wing parties do. I'm not going to go and actually work to find a better solutions to make your quality of life better. It's easier just to make you think that some minority is the one actually doing all the bad stuff to you. Time and time again, it show me a right-wing government anywhere in history. That's what they do.
And the they're doing it to our children. They're attacking our children. They're perverting our children. It's such an emotive thing for people. I mean, do you get the impression that many of the people at the protest actually had children in the school system, in Halton in particular? But I mean, I just generally
everyone there said they did. The ones I talked to said that they had kids somewhere in the system. I saw a lot of children, like I would say definitely under the age of 10, in the meeting, and of course there were a couple of high school students milling about as well. But everyone I talked to in the protest, they said they had kids somewhere in the system. So
but they weren't necessarily citing their own experience, with the exception of the child you mentioned.
Well, that's the thing, that nobody could tell me an actual story of a teacher forcing a student to change a pronoun or to pursue to identify as transgender. Nobody could tell me an actual story. It was all anecdotal, something that they heard from somebody. It's on a web, it's on a forum, it's always happening somewhere else, therefore it must be happening here. But nobody could tell me the details of where it's happening and what it's happened to. Is I'll look it up online, and I've tried, I can't find it. So clearly I'm looking at the wrong, and again, that's the thing, is like, we're clearly looking at the wrong sources of information on this. And
I mean, I have kind of an inside track on teachers, obviously anecdotal evidence of people I know who teach. But speaking to them, the irony of the situation is like a 5-minute conversation with a teacher, between the teacher and these people will be like, do you know, this is just so far not what we want to do as teachers. But their concerns day in and day out is for basic discipline, to be able to do the job, to be to all the things we've talked about over 3 years now. We've been doing this, and we've come back again and again and again to schools, and it's been pride flags and transgender rights and racism and I mean, a whole bunch of stuff that just does not actually come up on a day-to-day basis in the classroom. There was, in terms of the teachers doing their job, they want to indoctrinate children. They want to indoctrinate them to be decent human beings, to be respectful and kind and polite. And God knows that is extremely hard to do, and they're usually fighting a losing battle doing it.
Well, think of when you were in high school. How easy were you to be taught the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic? Right. I would say I want to add this bit that I thought was very telling at the end of the protest. So when the microphone was turned off and the cords were starting to be wound up, the protest pretty much just dissipated. Everybody just started to go to their walk back to their cars to go home. The anti-protesters stuck around for a bit to wave flags and whatnot, but for the most part, the protesters just went away after the speeches were done. At the end, I'm kind of sitting around, just kind of getting a sense of what's going on, looking around, and I look down the road, and right in front of M.M. Robinson High School, I see a group of teenagers, and they have trans pride flags kind of draped around their bodies and whatnot. And I said, I'm gonna go over and talk to them. I wonder if there's students here at MM. And I walked over, and some of them were not. Some of them had taken the day off to support their friends. But I asked them, I kind of talked with them. They were there. I noticed that they were there for most of the protests, and I flat out asked. They themselves said that they identified as trans. They were going on their journey. So I asked them, so at any point during your school life, have you been coerced or encouraged to identify as trans by your teachers? Have you been pressured at any point by your teachers to do this? And all of them said no. At the most part, their teachers just want them to hand their homework in on time. And at the most that they have is just an encouragement from a teacher saying that they're proud of them for being true to themselves. That is the most that they've had. But in terms of a organized conspiracy of teachers sitting them down for like a weekly brainwashing session of we're going to convince you that you're a trans person, no, that's not happening. And I thought it was telling that the protesters, all these people waving flags and signs, and the PPC supporters and whatnot, they literally had to walk 10 feet, Roland, literally 10 feet, and talk to these kids and say, tell us what's going on in this school. What are you dealing with? And they would have learned that no, they're kids dealing with the same crap that every other teenager has to deal with. They're trying to figure out who they are, and in some cases that might mean that they're a trans teen, in whatever case. But they're a teenage. They're trying to get their homework in on time. They're trying to figure out how to hang out with their friends. They're trying to take up passion projects, art, hobbies, that kind of thing, the stuff that teenagers are supposed to do. And I just thought it was telling that the protesters literally could have just walked 10 feet and asked them questions and maybe got a little bit more insight in terms of what is going on and kind of understand the truth. And the protesters didn't want to. They just did not want to have that conversation. To say,
it's like you say, I mean, the minute you start asking questions, you're the enemy.
Well, that's the thing. The minute you start asking questions, I had one gentleman that I had a long conversation with. One of the anti-protesters who had a pride flag around them, who I'd spoken with before when I spoke on the other side, came up to me and said, thank you for coming out and for talking. And I said, okay, thank you, and shook their hand and walked. And immediately I was like, okay, I can see I'm wasting my time here. You're not who you say you are. I'm like, I told you, I'm with this podcast. I've talked with them. I'm talking with you now. And the fact that I was friendly with the anti-protesters was evidence that I'm part of some conspiracy. And I said, I know I want to see, like, maybe there's a common ground here. Maybe there's some bridge that we could walk down that we're going to meet both sides. And I honestly don't know where that is, because if we can't ask the question of, where are we getting this? Is this factual? And we can't entertain the fact that, because the anti-protest side, I asked them, like, what are you thinking of this? And they said they understand that they're concerned for children's safety. We're all concerned that children have to be safe. But it's like a little bit of like, if you just trust your child that they're not going, and you just show a little love and compassion, it can go a long way. And that was coming from the anti-protester side. And I said, I try to find that measure in the protesters. And anytime I try and peel back that layer, I get shut down. I'm told I'm not looking at the right sources, and I'm not doing my job properly. And I thought, I don't know, if you're not willing to listen to the other side and see where they're coming from. I mean, I flat out asked, like, a number of people, like the anti-protesters, like, do you think they are real? No. They weren't even real. They honestly thought they were all actors, and
the counter protesters were all actors.
Yeah, like I remember that they're saying that the one guy said, "I'm taking time off of work to come here." I said, "Well, you don't think they're doing that too? You don't think some of those people are taking time off their work to come out and counter protest?" He says, "No, they're all being paid." I said, "By who?" He says, "They're all being paid by, they're all government employees who are being paid to come out and they don't work, they don't do anything, they just sit around and they're paid to do this." I said, like, I was speechless, because I'm like, I don't know how to combat. Like, they themselves weren't willing to just reach out and say, can we have a talk? Tell me about, like, the simple fact of saying, tell me your story. What is your story? And to contemplate the fact that maybe it is different than theirs was not something that they were willing to entertain. And I just walked away saying, I don't, and they don't want to entertain, because they're content in the belief that they are the majority, despite the fact that I mentioned this is happening across Canada. You don't have, like, every mayor in every town across Ontario and in my knowledge Canada had issued some kind of statement saying that they support the 2S LGBTQIA community. Mm-hmm. I had spoken with the anti-protest side. There was 3 different United Church ministers who were wearing their collars, so they were identifying themselves as ministers, marching in support of the anti-protest side. And I saw a Nutfield flag, the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario, saw their flag flying, and I said, okay, clearly, like, that's their side has a lot of support, and they're getting a lot of honks as well as the protester side. But to say that you're the majority, like, where's the majority coming from? You don't. You have the People's Party of Canada endorsing you. That's it. So to say that you're this majority movement, I kind of push back. But what do you think? Like, you don't have anybody. There's nobody of note or of consequence backing you in this movement today.
It's really, it all comes back to, and this is a hobby horse of mine, I guess. As some listeners may know, back in the ancient literally in the ancient mists of history, I was a historian. I mean, like, I actually did it for a living and got paid. And obviously, that's all about evidence. It's all about taking contradictory evidence produced by a variety of sources, weighing them up and going, okay, this one's reliable, this one's not, or this element of this one is reliable, this element of this one is reliable, or it's taken as evidence and it's trying to get as close to some kind of truth, in very inverted commas, as close to the truth as you can get based on the evidence available. And I really think that we should teach, like, alongside maths and English and things like that. And it kind of does happen. So I don't want to say it doesn't happen. Part of what is taught in schools is understanding evidence. Yeah, I kind of think we should put a label on it more to say, okay, today you're going to learn understanding evidence for an hour a week or 2 hours a week, whatever.
Yeah.
So that when children leave school, they're not indoctrinated, but they are taught to think for themselves, to see. I mean, and it's so much more important now with the changes in information that have happened during our lifetimes, where information is far less reliable, where basically very smart people that I know, I have seen go down the rabbit hole of Breitbart and conspiracy theories and right-wing craziness. People who really, I would have thought, would have been better at weeding out the garbage. And I'm not saying that everybody should be left-wing and that if you read the proper sources, you're going to be like me and believe the stuff I believe. I don't think that would be healthy or necessarily right.
What?
But the ability to look at stuff and go, no, this is crap. And this is somewhat reliable.
It's not even that necessarily. I like it. It was just building the self-confidence to acknowledge that you might be wrong. Because I look at, I walked away from that, and I spent the last couple of days kind of pondering like what I experienced, because I was hoping that I was maybe I was naive, but I was hoping I'd find there's some commonality there. There's some that the protesters, and I know that I'm going to get in trouble for this, but I do think they, at their core, they're good people. They want their children to succeed, but they're
rank and file. I'm not going to include the People's Party of Canada.
No,
in that
I want to. Yeah, you're right. The organizers, I think, are being politically motivated, but I didn't want to talk to them. I want to talk to the average person in the protest, because I want to, like, why did you come out to this? And I don't think it's because they are inherently bigoted or transphobic. I don't. Not from what I've talked to them, but they are being fed lies. They are being fed a mistruth and lies about the situation. And what's dangerous about that lie that being fed is that it's so encompassing and it is so it cuts them off. Because I was like, the fact that they literally could have walked 10 feet in either direction and had a conversation with people who identify as trans, as LGBTQIA, and I had a conversation, an actual talk, and say, what are your fears? These are mine. And my bet is they would have said, okay, I may not be, I'm not 2S LGBTQIA, but I can understand where you're coming from. And at the end say, no, you're not there to prey on my son or daughter. You're there, we all want our children to succeed in life. And it may not be something I understand or I'm going through, but I know that you're not there to hurt my kid. And that was the telling part, is that the protesters did not want to take that 10 steps and have that conversation. Because I know that the people because I was speaking with the people on the anti-protest side, they were willing to have that conversation. They were scared of them. They are like, these people are saying that they do not exist, that they are predators and should be feared. And so I understand they are scared, but talking with them, they were willing to have that conversation. They were willing to tell them the truth of their lives. And if the protesters had the courage to just walk 10 feet and say, I'm willing to have that conversation quietly and away from the rhetoric, my bet is many of those protesters would have come around and said, yeah, I don't get all of it, but I know you're not here to hurt me or my children. And that might have been just what was needed to put this all situation to bed.
One of the reasons we started this podcast, and one of the reasons why we'll never be millionaires from doing this podcast.
Speak for yourself, Roland.
Well,
I don't know.
I'd like to be 100 we started it because, among other things, because there is so much media that is at the extremes, which is about shouting across the divide and calling the other side morons. And although this is a progressive, anyone who's listened to this knows we're pretty damn progressive. We're pretty anti a lot of things that conservatives do. But I think we have repeated often enough over the years that we are willing to hear good arguments. We're willing to interview conservatives who want to come on here at this podcast and put their point of view and argue it and be willing to discuss it, not even debate it, but discuss it. But we never get those people. Now, sure, if I was on some right-wing podcast, I dare say I wouldn't have ND people queuing up to come into my podcast either, but I bet we'd get a couple. The refusal to speak, whichever side of the political divide you're on, the refusal to speak or listen to or hear the other side is nearly always totally destructive of communication breaks down. There's a dispute, communication breaks down, the two sides no longer speak to each other, and nothing ever gets better in that situation. I mean, it's like, people getting divorced. You go from living together, and even though you may not like each other very much, you're basically coexisting, to literally hating each other's guts and disputing who gets the cookie barrel that grandma used to own. And I'm using that because that's an actual example that I've heard of. The only way this stuff ever gets solved is by people sitting down and talking to each other and listening to the other side. Now, I think one side in this debate is pretty much on the money, and one side in this debate is pretty much doesn't know what they're talking about. But I still think, I think, you respect people's right to, we need to respect people's right to be wrong, and to say, well, you know what? I don't think you've seen all the evidence that would help you come to a conclusion on this. Would you like to look at it? But if the other person's like, no, I'm not even going to look. I'm not interested. I'm not interested. Then you've got no way to progress. And then that's so much of the debate and all kinds of politics. And right now comes down to that same thing of people basically saying, no, you're idiots. You're the enemy. You're evil. There is nothing that I can get from talking to you that will help. And that's nearly always the wrong thing to say.
But if you're right. That you can't talk. But I found that, again, the protest side talking with them is that it was to take the stance that they have means that they cannot question it. They cannot put it up against somebody's lived experience. So you can't like, even the idea of a lived experience. What does that mean? Well, it means exactly what it sounds like. They've gone through different things than you have. You've had different challenges to overcome than the other person has. That doesn't make anyone better or worse. It's just you've got a different life that you've lived. You've had different challenges to overcome. You've overcome them in different ways. It doesn't negate your challenges, same as yours don't negate the others. It's just different. And I find that talking about the protest side, it was this inability to see that was fueling this. And it starts off with again, your gut fear of, hey, man, you're hiding something about my child from me in the school system. Yes. Right off the bat, any parent says, whoa, red flag. I'm not comfortable with that. And that's kind of where the criticism stops. And and that's where you have the PPC party flying in to fuel that fear, to say, oh no, it's not. Why is this happening? What's the other side saying? No, they're coming to mutilate and pervert your children and to prey on them, and all this nonsense, this old tired trope of the homosexual as being a predator for children. It is a trope that has gone back. It is as long as anti-Semitism has been around. It's the same trope of, you're different, therefore you must be a threat.
As Kathleen Wynne said a couple of weeks ago, and anybody listening from the protester side is going to turn right off the minute I use that name, but it's true. They lost the battle on gay and lesbian rights, so transgender rights is the wedge that they can use to revivify that whole argument, to have a go at people who are different, who don't fit into the Christian worldview. Let's call it what it is, because like you say, the People's Party of Canada guy was not talking about religion, and he was talking about Christianity by the sound of it.
It was, and I find it interesting the number of Muslim women there who wore the niqab and the hijab there, and that's fine.
The irony of them standing side by side with the people.
Well, I find it ironic because I'm pretty sure this is a party that would entirely embrace the idea of the barbaric practices hotline to
literally rip that niqab right off your head.
I was kind of be careful who you're cozying up to there, because they can turn on you the minute that this project falls down. So I found that interesting in itself. Maybe that's worth examining at a later date, but it was eye-opening. I my take is I don't necessarily see this 1 million person march, because it's not they did not get 1 million people out. I see it as it'll fizzle away, the same as the vaccine mandates will go away, because the truck convoy kind of morphed into this, and it'll morph into something else down the road. It is a grievance vehicle. People who are tired and fed up with kind of being trampled on economically, which I get, that I can get on board with entirely. But it's easier to deal with the idea of it's the problem is somebody else. Somebody else did this to me, as opposed to, no, we actually have to talk about real structural change and wage increased wages, or subsidized housing, or taxation reform. Anything, those things are complex, and those need a lot of thought to be put behind. It's easier to say, no, it's transgender people, or it's immigrants, or whatever have you, whoever the boogeyman of the hour might be. So I suspect this will morph into something else. They'll go after somebody else when people don't get behind the idea of a trans, that the trans people, that there is no conspiracy to corrupt or to force children to change their identities in Ontario schools. That this is just not happening. They'll move on to a different boogeyman, whatever that might be.
Well, I think we should leave it there. We've talked a long time about this, but I think it's really interesting to explore it in a respectful way. I mean, if people from the protest are listening, they're probably going to be pissed off with this because we don't agree with them. But and I doubt any of them will listen. But you know what? I think we've given it a respectful view, more respectful than the PC. Certainly, and some of the people in the crowd, I suspect, would give to transgender youth. And I hope the counter protest and the fact that these protests, whatever their size, are not that huge when you compare it to the Black Lives Matter protests that happened a few years ago, which were vast in number, even in Burlington. That any transgender youth or gay and lesbian youth listening, I hope you take that message and understand it for what it is, that most people are behind you. We should leave it there.
Yep.
And we'll be back soon with another episode of the 905er podcast. Goodbye.
That's it for this episode of the 905er. Thank you for listening. As always, you can send us your feedback, thoughts, and concerns or ideas for future episodes to our email, info@905er.ca. We'd love to hear from you. You can help us keep the 905er going by financially supporting us through Patreon as well as PayPal. Visit us at 905er.ca and click on the support tab. As well, links are in the show notes for your convenience. Lastly, you can find us on social media. Search for _905er on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So long for now. See you next time.